Okay, so I took down a video that I had up for a short while because it had a arithmetic error, so I decided to go ahead and correct that error, as well as add some more information. I was able to find some even more information to have some more accurate numbers, so hopefully that will be a good way to replace the previous video. So in this video, I want to take a look at how much do tokens actually cost. All of these companies want to eventually sell tokens at a profit, so we want to find the cost and then how much more do we need to price the tokens for a profit. So in order to figure this out, we're going to take a look at server acquisition, the cost of power, cooling, network, and so forth. Then we'll estimate some token prices and then look at some conclusions. And then I've added some sources, both in this video and then in the description below. So server acquisition, we need to acquire capital. So we're going to look at getting the price of these servers. H200s have been used for a lot of server farms in the past year or so. So we're going to look at the NVIDIA H200. And to get an 8 GPU rack of these things with everything hooked up is around $300,000, $300,000 to $320,000. But we're going to take the lower value here. In fact, we're going to be very generous for these, for the prices of things. We're always going to try to take the lower number as far as costs are concerned. So $300,000 is what we're going to use. And then we know that the system power is going to be around 10 kilowatts, but they already have an estimate for us for the power, cooling, and network costs, which we'll take a look at in just a few seconds. So let's take a look at how much per hour does it cost to run a server. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take this $300,000 divided by 8 servers, and we're going to amortize this cost over 5 years. Some people will say, you know, these servers will need to be replaced earlier than that, but let's try to stretch the lifetime. We're going to be as generous as possible and stretch out these GPUs and motherboards, hard drives, everything for 5 years. And that's $7,500 per year. So then if we take that $7,500 per year, divide it by 365 and a quarter days per year, because remember there are leap years, which have a year, a day every 4 years, and then divide that by 24 hours a day, that's 86 cents per hour. So not too bad. Now we're going to look at power, cooling, networking, and support. And in the previous slide, which I can show you here, it says $60,000 to $80,000 for a 3-year contract. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick the lower amount of that number once again. So even though prices have gone up in the past year, we're going to pick the lower number. $60,000 divided by 3 years, divided by 8 servers, that's $2,500 per year. And of course, we can figure that out by dividing it out to get the cost per hour. And that would be 29 cents per hour. So if we add that 29 cents per hour to our previous 86 cents per hour, we get $1.15 per hour to run our servers. So now we can start thinking about estimating token prices. So in order to do that, we're going to have to figure out just a few more items. And the first thing that we're going to do is we need a model, right? If we're going to figure out the price per million tokens, we need to actually run a model. So Kimi K2.5 is the largest open source model that exists. And in fact, here are the parameters. It is a 1 trillion parameter model. And it is also one of those mixture of expert models. So it only has 32 billion active parameters at any one period in time for inference. So that's what we're going to use as our example. So keep in mind that OpenAI and Anthropic models, their frontier models are going to be bigger and therefore more expensive than this one. So local deployment hardware requirements, they say 8 H100s. Now we're going to use H200s, which are a little bit better, they have more RAM, and they're a little bit faster. And I actually found a website where somebody ran H200s, and in fact, they used 8 H200s to run this model. But yeah, that's the system requirements. The GPU memory for this, the H200s have 141 gigabytes of RAM versus the H100s with 80 gigabytes of RAM. So that will allow us to use fewer GPUs. And so what we're going to do is calculate that out. We're going to need approximately 640 gigabytes of RAM, divide by 141, which will give us 4.5, which rounds up to 5 H200s. Now, I did say that this other site that I found ran 8 H200s, but we're going to be generous and make the cost less, right? So we're going to use 5 H200s at $1.15 an hour. That gives us $5.75 an hour. So far, less than minimum wage. Pretty good. So, but there are other costs because all that we've had here is essentially we've got a rack of servers. We've plugged them into power, and we have networking costs as well as some support costs. But there are other costs, right? So we need servers for training. We need whole other data centers for training, fine-tuning, and experiments for our researchers. And so let's just assume that we have a 1-to-1 ratio. For every server we have at inference making us money, we're going to have a server doing some training and experiments. In the future, that ratio will probably be less or more, depending on which number you put first. But in the future, there probably will be lots of servers doing inference versus a small amount training. But it takes an enormous amount of compute for training. So right now, we're going to say that ratio is about 1-to-1. And so that means that we'll have to double our cost. So instead of $5.75 an hour, instead of $5.75 an hour, it's now $11.50 an hour. Still not too bad. But we also have utilization cost, right? So if we run these servers for inference, they're not going to be running at full power all the time, right? We're not going to have 100% utilization of every single GPU all the time. We're going to have some servers that are sitting there waiting for customers to use them. And in reality, you actually do want a little bit of slack because if you're at 100%, that means if one person more tries to use your services, they're not going to be able to use your services. And so we know that most of the time, most of the customers are going to be in the United States. And of course, there's also a large chunk in Europe. But that means that there's several time zones where there's not going to be very many customers. There's going to be some, but just not very many. And then even in the busy areas like the United States and Europe, you're not going to have 100% utilization all the time. So that means that utilization will probably be around 60%, but we're going to be generous and say that they're at 80% utilization, right? So that 80% of the time they're using 100% of their capacity. So that means that they'll have to take that 20% of the time that they're not making money. Well, that's going to have to be lumped into that 80% of the time that they are using inference. So we're going to increase the price by about 20%. And so instead of $11.50 an hour, it's going to be $13.80 an hour. So still not too bad. So how many tokens per second do we get out of these servers? Well, like I said, I was able to find a website where they actually ran real tests with H200s, and they got token per second counts of around 40 to 52 tokens per second. Now, to be generous, we're going to take that more on the upper side. We're going to say 50 tokens per second. So I'm not even taking the average, which would be around 45 or 46. We're going to take the upper part. So we're going to say 50 tokens per second is what we're going to be able to get out of these H200s. So 1 million tokens at 50 tokens a second is around 5.5 hours per million tokens. So now we can take our hourly rate, multiply it by 5.56 hours per million tokens, and that will give us $76.73 per million tokens. So notice that that's higher than both OpenAI and Anthropic's top-of-the-line model costs outside of Mythos. So this is noticeably still at a loss because there are a bunch more, there are many more factors that we haven't taken into account. such as the building itself. Right now, we just have servers sitting out in a field with plugged into power. You have to take into account the cost of building, having security personnel, security systems, the technicians to run these things, the salaries of all of the researchers, right? Which those are very high salaries, $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 per year per person. And of course, taxes, and then eventually you need profit. And so we haven't taken any of these things into account, and it costs $76 per million tokens. And this is with a small model, right? A smaller model than Opus, Cloud Opus 4.6 and GPT-5.4. So what would profitable inference look like? Of course, this is hard to estimate, but what we're going to say is that all of those other costs, right? All of these other things, the building, the security, the technicians, the salaries, all of that is going to be 25%, right? So let's add 25% to the cost, which will be $95.91 per million tokens. And then let's say that we want, actually not a 50% profit margin. We're going to say we want a 30% profit margin, right? So at a 30% profit margin, we divide by 0.7, which will give us a 30% margin. And that gives us $137.01 per million tokens. And notice that this is with Kimi 2.5. Right? So if we want to sell at a 30% profit margin, the estimated cost is $137 per million tokens. So if we compare this to the price of GPT-5.4, it's $15 per million output tokens. And with Claude Opus 4.6, it's $25 per million output tokens. So notice 137 is a whole lot more than these models, and these models are even bigger, right? And of course, like I said, that's only for Kimi and GPT, and the latest GPT and Opus models are larger, and therefore they're going to cost more. How much more are these models going to cost? How much more does Opus 4.6 and GPT-5.4 cost? Well, just yesterday, Anthropic Mythos preview came out, and they're charging 5 times the price of Claude Opus 4.6. And so maybe Opus 4.6 costs 2 times what Kimi 2.5 does, right? I mean, we could say that Kimi is, Opus 4.6 is way better than Kimi. Like, we could say that Opus 4.6 costs 5 times as much. But, let's be generous and say that Opus 4.6 only costs 2 times as much, right? So it costs 2 times as much. And of course, we still want our 30% profit. So that means that, Opus 4.6 and maybe GPT-5.4 cost somewhere, or maybe they should charge you around $274 per million tokens. And that is, way more than the $25 per million tokens. So that's around 10x, which makes sense because in my previous video, I talked about how Anthropic said that they were giving people $5,000 of compute for $200 of cost. And that is around 25 times the cost. And so this is really 10, or what was it? It was 25 times the cost, but this is only 10x, right? So maybe my estimate is low. I don't know. But it seems that their cost should be around 10x of what it currently is. If they're charging $25 per million tokens, maybe they should be charging $250. And of course, there's no way to know for certain because they don't publish their financials. As soon as they open up and become a public company, we'll know what these costs actually are. But it looks like $250, $274 is going to be the actual cost to sell these things at a profit. So conclusions, it looks like as far as things currently stand, inference is not profitable. If you're going to charge, $15 per output tokens, per million output tokens, and $25 per million output tokens, and it costs you $274 per million output tokens, well, inference is just not profitable. That means prices must increase. And there's going to be lots of creative ways to lower these prices. One of the ways is shrinkflation. So essentially give you less tokens or less compute at the same price. So one way of doing this would be to just lower your token quota. But another way would be to use higher quantized models, right? They'll give you either a lower model or a higher quantization of a model, which means the model is actually less accurate. It's going to give you less performance, but they can run it on fewer GPUs. That's a way of giving you less, having you pay the same price, but you get less performance out of it. But even that will not be good enough. They'll have to raise these prices eventually. And it's going to have to be probably at least 10x based on, these numbers here. So that's essentially my conclusions, as well as all the conclusions that I had from the previous video. And here's the sources that I have, and of course I've added them beneath. And hopefully I don't have to make, I want to get back to some programming, but yeah, so I just wanted to have another video looking at actual cost of tokens. All right, until next time.